Okay. All right. Folks, welcome. This is the Salim Ismail podcast. This is episode number 10. I'm thrilled to have with us today the former head of many things at UNESCO, John Crowley, who, first of all, welcome, John. How are you?
Hi, very
Where,
nice to be with you.
where are you?
I'm in Paris, France.
Okay. And you're American originally?
I'm British by birth, Irish by nationality, French by adoption.
French. Wow. Full Anglo-Saxon, Norman blood. Okay. And you're living in Paris. For 18 years, you were running the Foresight Institute. No, remind me the actual title.
Well, it changed a lot over the years. UNESCO gets restructured every 5 or 6 years, but for the last 8 of those years, I was running a section in UNESCO called Research Policy and Foresight in the social and human sciences.
And that's critical from the future scanning and horizon scanning for the organization. And for the viewers in the audience that aren't familiar, give them a quick snapshot as to what UNESCO was about and what UNESCO tries to achieve.
Sure. So first of all, the name UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. So it's one of a whole family of specialized agencies within the UN that was set up mostly in the late 40s to conduct specific lines of business within the UN mandate. There's, as many people know, World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, and so on. So UNESCO, education, science, culture. And basically what UNESCO does in those 3 areas, which have remained, obviously, the content has changed over the years, but the basic principle is the same. What UNESCO does in those 3 areas is essentially 2 things. International diplomacy, educational diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, scientific diplomacy, which means getting the member states of the UN together to decide on things jointly,
Like
which are
education
then applicable
standards,
to all
for
of them.
example.
Exactly. And
Okay.
sometimes what they decide on takes legal form. There are conventions and recommendations and declarations. And sometimes what they decide on just has a programmatic form. They decide to work on certain things together. And at the same time, UNESCO is engaged in international cooperation in those areas. So in my case, international science cooperation, which means mainly working not just with governments, but also with scientific institutions, councils, foundations, academies, and so on, to bring scientists together to obviously respond to governmental agendas, but also set science agendas and think about how cooperation can, and that's ultimately the mandate of the whole UN system, contribute to peace in the world.
Hmm.
It's been done with mixed success since 1945, but of course the baseline is a kind of counterfactual. How much worse would it have been if we hadn't had the UN and its specialized agencies?
Yeah.
And of course, we'll never know.
Yeah.
But the feeling that it might have been much worse if we hadn't had it is one that is at least plausible.
You know, I'm one of the ones that has kind of done a fair amount of picking away at the UN, going, big bureaucratic organization, etc. But you're making a very important point, which is when you look at the actual historical trend of humanity, the last 100 years has been about the most peaceful in human existence. And not by accident was the UN created, and the Bretton Woods created all these institutions. And we've had a pretty decent run of it over the last several decades until the last few years. What do you think is causing the world to fall apart increasingly now? I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And I ask this question because you're one of the deeper thinkers that I've come across with, you look at it from a global perspective, plus the experience you've had dealing with dozens and hundreds of member states over decades. There's few people in the world, I think, that can comment at a macro level as to what's happening. So how do you think about what's going on in the world today and why?
That's a very flattering presentation. It really puts the pressure on me, right? I think an important way of looking at it is the connection between ideas and institutions in this case. And of course, there are technologies are a very big part of this general picture as well, but put them to one side for the moment. The way in which institutions work is connected to the kind of sense they make. And there is a lag between the sense that they make and the practical institutional life of those institutions. Hence the point that's often been made, most famously by Gramsci, but he's not the only one to have emphasized this point, that you can often find yourself in a situation where yesterday's institutions are still institutionally alive because people are committed to them, work within them, fund them, take them for granted, and so on. But the purposes for which they were designed, the ideas that they make sense in terms of, are obsolete. And it's pretty clear that we're in that kind of gap today. The institutions of the United Nations were entirely shaped by the Cold War. Now, of course, they were born in many cases just before the Cold War started. But the UN itself was created in 1945. But very quickly, the framework within which they were set was the Cold War. And the Cold War involved, obviously, two antagonistic blocs plus a non-aligned decolonizing world that could imagine themselves as engaged at the same time in a process of geopolitical confrontation and in a process of joint scientific and technological development. And indeed, the language of development was one of the things that allowed those divides to be bridged. It meant something similar to everyone, whether you were in the US, in the USSR, in India, or in Malawi. Development. And development understood as essentially scientific and technological development reflected in physical infrastructures. Though everyone, of course, agreed, and the creation of UNESCO is one sign of that, that the intangible infrastructures of human capital as developed through education were also important. Now, the Cold War was a time of tensions, of course. There were hot wars in many parts of the world as a consequence of various kinds of spillover from great power rivalry. So this wasn't some idealized period of perfect peace. But what it was a period where the institutions and the ideas were to some extent in tune with one another. That started to erode in the late 70s with the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, which instead of seeing the Cold War as the setting within which to organize things, saw it as a war to be won, but without necessarily thinking about what will come next. And it definitively collapsed in the 1990s. And it's interesting that UNESCO's Management of Social Transformations program was created by UNESCO, by the member states, in 1994 as a response within the intergovernmental framework to this challenge of what comes next. The Berlin Wall has just come down. The Soviet Union has just been dissolved. What happens next? What are the ideas through which either the current set of institutions can be revitalized, making sense in new terms, or perhaps, if necessary, new institutions could be created to respond to the ideas that we need for today? And as many of the people watching probably remember, in the 1990s, there were some ideas about that. Basically, the idea that globalization, understood as a technical process, we're all going to share the same new technologies, in particular through the development of the internet, trade. No coincidence that the World Trade Organization was created at precisely the same time as UNESCO's Management of Social Transformations program, and the circulation of ideas in the form of a certain kind of minimalistic institutional idea of democracy, with the assumption, often explicitly stated, that if you export the institutions of democracy, the ideas will follow. Now, of course, many people, even in the mid-1990s, were saying, sorry, this doesn't work. It doesn't work in principle, and it's very unlikely to work in practice. Just to name check someone who, at the time, was a friend. In 1995, not because he later ceased to be a friend, simply because he passed away, of course. In 1995, Ben Barber published Jihad versus Macworld, which was a very influential book at the time, making the argument, as the title suggests, that instead of seeing radical religious movements and more generally identity-driven movements as oppositional to globalization, they should actually be seen as two sides of the same coin. So that the process of globalizing technology, trade, and very impoverished ideas of democracy produces, by the same movement, the antagonistic dynamics that will fight it and perhaps ultimately undermine it. And you could say that 9/11, is almost, it's as if someone read Ben's book and decided to turn it into a script, showing in the real world how true what he wrote down on the page was.
It's
And the
almost like
big question,
it's almost like a physics reaction. You have an action and a reaction,
yeah,
right? And so,
exactly.
okay, go ahead. Please continue.
And the big question, which I worked on in UNESCO from 2003 in various programs and through various kinds of institutional restructurings, was ultimately all about that 1990s question. Do we have a set of ideas that make sense of our current institutions? And if we don't, what can we do about it? And I think the answer that emerged from the real world, as well as from all the programs I was involved with, was no, we don't have ideas that make sense of the world, as of the institutions as they are, but we don't have the capacity to produce new ideas, and we don't have the capacity to produce new institutions either.
Hmm.
The UN tried. It tried once at the turn of the millennium through the Millennium Summit in 2000,
Yes.
where Kofi Annan and his advisors sought to reshape the UN around a completely new vision, attuned to that technology plus trade plus democracy vision of the 1990s, in order to re-equip it for a new era. But of course, again, 9/11 came barely a year later. So the Millennium Summit was dead in the water before the process of trying to implement it had even started. And many of the key elements, as you know, including reform of the Security Council, were immediately blocked by the most powerful member states.
Yeah.
So the UN is still what it used to be, but it's not obvious why. That's the challenge.
You know, this goes back to the commentary that Buckminster Fuller, right? You can't ever fix the existing problems. You have to create new systems at the edge and let those become the new gravity center, right? I noticed that there are efforts. One of the areas where you and I have considerable overlap is the idea from many people, including Paul Sappho, who first popularized this with me, that we're moving from a nation state to a city state emphasis over this century. And you kind of ideally want the UN to look like a parliament of mayors managing the commons and very localized models going forward. And if you take a city with solar energy and vertical farming and a satellite internet, you don't really need much of a nation state, right? Do you agree with that general trend and premise? And if so, how do we bring that into being?
Good question. I'm not sure I totally agree. I'll try to explain why. But what is clear is that the whole UN system, and indeed the whole of political modernity, is based on the idea of the nation state. Building nations, building states. And of course, building economies attuned to those nations and states, including by the physical organization of space and by the symbolic organization of society around education, anthems, flags, national sport, and all the rest. This was developed in the 19th century. It proved very powerful because it was consistent with the technological processes of the Industrial Revolution. It made sense of them, it enabled them, and it was empowered by them. Because, in particular, of colonial domination, the whole UN Charter was set up on that basis, on the assumption that, in principle at least, every nation had the right to be a state, and every state had the right to be a sovereign entity within the UN. It's clear that that doesn't quite work, and that the exceptions, which have always existed, multinational states are always possible as an outlier case, even within the nation-state framework, are actually not outliers, but the norm. And this raises a major difficulty, which is the legitimacy of the state was historically and idealistically constructed as the political legal form of the nation. And the nation was not simply a bunch of people. It was a bunch of people connected to a territory, to a history, to cultural markers such as language and national heroes and museums and folklore and traditions and so on. Once you break that link, how do you legitimize the state? And I think one of the difficulties with trying to reshape the geography is that the problem of the nation state is going to reemerge wherever you put the geographical level. A city, a self-governing city, is still going to have the challenge of legitimizing itself in terms its government and its governance, not just the institutions, but also the processes, in terms of an idea of democracy, which in a very broad sense is part of our self-understanding these days. The idea that, which comes from Kant, to be moral is to be subject to one's own laws as an individual, but also as a collective. And if someone else is making laws for me that I don't get to contribute to or be part of, then I feel alienated, left behind, excluded, as we see in the politics of every country these days. The big debates this week in France, as you know, about pension reform.
Yeah.
And the form of that debate is a feeling among many sections of the population that the government just isn't listening to them, that it is acting for technocratic reasons to make certain changes to the pension system, but is deaf to the concerns of the population. And
you mentioned
a pretty reasonable assessment.
You mentioned multinational kind of entities. Can you give us an example just so it anchors in our head?
Well, I think, first of all, during the Cold War period, the Soviet Union was the ultimate multinational entity.
Okay.
So there was a reference point for a state, a member of the UN, recognized as a sovereign state with central political authority, that by no standard was national because it explicitly recognized the diversity of nationalities within it. And that became an important reference point for other states that, for whatever reason, couldn't think of themselves as national, but wanted to create coexistence. Now, Soviet Union's gone, but let me take another example, which is a very obvious one. I was born there, the UK.
Yeah.
The UK is a multinational state, and increasingly sees itself as a multinational state. That's not a scandal. It's not a violation of the fundamental principles of modernity, but it is an exception.
I'm from India originally, and right there you have an example of that, where you've got 20 different major languages and complete chaos of understanding between different segments, yet it does operate as a nation state, lumbers along. The best comment I heard about India a few weeks ago was, if you look at the history of India, the optimists are disappointed and the pessimists are disappointed. And I thought that was just a great framing for the progress or lack thereof that's been made over the decades. So if you go back to the future, there's also massive gaps in the nation state problem. Like you take the problem of the Kurds, which sit across, or the Palestinians, which sit across multiple areas, or historical things that have happened, like the India-Pakistan issue and China and Tibet and so on. I guess for the most part, if I take the pro-UN perspective, for the most part, nation-state systems have mostly worked, except for these few hotspots. But something different is happening now, and I don't know how to qualify it or frame it in the terms of what's happening at the national level or the nation-state level. Maybe you have some wisdom or insights around this.
Yeah, I think the question of political authority and political legitimacy is actually at the heart of it. The idea of the nation state, not necessarily the messy reality, but the abstract idea, is that there's something called nations, which come from history and which are people shaped by culture, territory, language, and so on. And these people want to govern themselves. And indeed, in the UN Charter, they have a right to self-government. And the form in which they can govern themselves is a state which, to the same people and the same territory, applies a certain set of institutional rules, including rules for who gets to govern and so on, and how laws are made. And because the state is the legal political form of the nation, there's a kind of seamless, at least ideal, connection between the authority of the state and the legitimacy derived from representing the nation. If that breaks down, then there's an immediate problem, which is why this particular state? The nation gives a logic for the way in which the lines are drawn on the map. The logic comes from history, of course. It's not some kind of absolute essentialist logic, but the history is meaningful, and people can see how their particular state came to be put together. If you look at a map of France since the year 1000, it gradually, from a central band, aggregated the periphery to become France we know today. That was an arbitrary process. It could have happened differently. But the way it did happen can be recognized by people as part of their shared history, the construction of France.
Right.
And the same could be said of many other places. If people cease to believe in the nation, then the state has a problem, which is what legitimizes it. Now, there are alternatives. One possibility, which was central to the work of the Frankfurt School, Jürgen Habermas wrote a very interesting book in 1973 called Legitimation Crisis in Late Capitalism. He made the point that when national legitimacy doesn't work, or as in the case of Germany, is suspect for reasons of German history, then you can compensate for that by the legitimacy of technical prosperity. So the government is legitimized by being effective at giving the population what it wants, and therefore can be accepted as authoritative within their particular territory. But what happens when prosperity breaks down, when the state no longer delivers the goods? So that option can also decline. Another possible option is a kind of formalistic approach. It doesn't really matter who makes up the political community, so long as it has certain procedures to govern itself with elections and constitutional courts and political parties and all the other stuff, then it can be legitimized through its own processes in a kind of virtuous circle. But of course, if that starts to break down because people no longer join political parties, no longer bother voting, are skeptical about the virtues of the people who govern them, who have shown themselves often to be crooks and liars and so on, you recognize the kind of social media language that's all around these days, then that breaks down too. And we've, I think, in the last 40 years, gone through a series of cycles where the various options for legitimizing the state have been eroded. The national legitimacy, it still works in some places, of course, but in many places it's questioned by historically constituted peripheries, Scotland, Catalonia, by rather artificial historical constructions that no longer quite work. Belgium, split between language communities that were bolted together in 1830 for reasons that no longer make sense to anyone.
You could argue they didn't make sense then. I mean, I lived in Belgium for a while, and if I remember right, the history, the Duke of Wallonia and the Duke of Flanders got upset with their respective French and Dutch governments and said, oh, let's just join together and form a country, ignoring the rather broad gaps in language, culture, economies, everything, right? And it's just it's literally two different nations in one state, right? And nothing gets done.
You know the story the Belgians tell about why they left the Netherlands, which is a fun way of putting it. They say, of course, we speak Dutch, they speak Dutch. They used to govern us, not a big deal in itself. But the big difference between Belgians and Dutch people is that Belgians eat well and have fun. And the eating well and have fun stuff was a logic of similarity with Wallonia, on one condition: the prestige of French as the high language of culture.
Right.
And in the 19th century, basically everyone in the Flemish elite was fluent in French.
Yes.
And gradually in the 20th century, this came to be seen as an unacceptable form of subordination. Why would we learn their language when they don't bother learning ours? Which was true.
Yep.
And that led to the current divisions, which are increasingly basically leading the country to drift apart. As the Belgians themselves say, we have only 4 things in common, one of which is part of the problem. We have a royal family. Okay, why not? We have, probably much more important, a soccer team. And Belgians care about soccer, and it's a genuinely integrated team. And we have social security, which is one of the few federal institutions that Belgium still has. The pension and health insurance system is federal, not communal. And then the fourth thing they have is Brussels. Brussels is geographically in Flanders, but for historical reasons, largely French speaking. And therefore, Flanders can't imagine independence without Brussels. And no one else could imagine the independence of Flanders with Brussels. So it kind of bolts the two together, but in a way that makes no one happy. And then something else that's really important is the process of immigration. And the way in which immigration has created groups within societies. This is very true in every European country, in North America, in Australia, in many other places, who see themselves as, of course, belonging to the society, citizens of the state, but not necessarily sharing the national history.
Yeah.
So, and Britain is an interesting case of this. There was a lot of discussion over the years as to how Black people in the UK, whether of West Indian or African origin, could consider themselves in terms of the institutions of the UK. And what used to be common, I think it's probably politically incorrect now, but you can find a lot of literature from the 70s and 80s of people saying this, is I have no problem seeing myself as a Black British person, because Britain is a set of legal institutions. It's not a nation. So I find my place as someone with a different origin, different trajectory, but sharing the same civic institutions. So Black Britishness could be seen, and the same, of course, for Pakistani Britishness, Indian Britishness, Bangladeshi Britishness, could be seen as a form of civic identity. On the other hand, most Black people would have said, I can't see myself as English, because Englishness is exclusive. And if you look back at the history of the UK over the last 10 years, you see how Brexit was very largely the expression of that exclusiveness. In theory, the UK left the European Union, but in reality, given the size of England and the way in which English nationalism played a key role in Brexit, it's actually England that left the EU, taking Scotland with it against the wishes of Scotland. Northern Ireland, Wales, also interesting cases, but let's not go there, it's too complicated. And as everyone knows who's following this, the question of whether Scotland will stay part of the UK from an important, but perhaps not central question until 2016. There have been two referendums on it. Both referendums have said no to independence, has now become the single most important issue in Scotland and by extension in the UK, because if Scotland leaves, there's no UK anymore.
Yeah.
All of that down to this tension between the national and the state.
Yeah.
Or the nation and the state. And I think, and coming back to your original question, which is fascinating, and I'm probably talking too much here, taking it down to the city level doesn't actually solve that, because every geographical level is going to have these potential fractures where at some point you have to say, why this particular geography? And that has to be justified in ways that can't be just formal and procedural. We all elect the same mayor, so we're all part of the same city. Sure, but why were those boundaries drawn the way they were?
You know, cities or nation states historically had, in general, very defined boundaries, right? The Himalayas bounding and separating India from China, or the oceans, etc., etc. In a digital world, I guess a huge question becomes where do those boundaries sit, and how do you even describe those, especially when you can fly anywhere and move everywhere so quickly these days. I guess we lose. You know, we talk in our world coming from Singularity University, X Prize, the EXO movement, etc. 100 years ago, anything important in the world happened within a day's walk. Right? Today, something that happens in Tokyo affects us in seconds. I mean, it's incredible to me, the reverberation of the Silicon Valley Bank collapse hitting Europe and Japan and bank stocks all over the world as people look at this. So if we kind of go, okay, the current structures don't work, how do you see this? What have you ever seen a structure? The prominence and the increased emphasis on city states is one path. Is there another format or structure that you've seen that you think might work?
No, not one that I've seen. But I
Right.
think there are some ideas incipient in the transformations of the world that might offer some interesting paths.
Okay.
But no, they haven't been experimented, they haven't succeeded. And it's interesting that you mentioned singularity. Of course, it's an institution, but singularity is topology. And what's ultimately the challenges we face are topological challenges, which is why I'm not sure just changing geographical scale makes a difference, because every geographical scale is going to raise the same issues. And indeed, an aside on that, it's interesting how this set of challenges and crises within political thinking have led to the reemergence of something that everyone thought was completely dead, which is extreme libertarianism,
Yeah.
including in the form of radical survivalism. The idea that I'm only truly free if I depend on no one for anything, which means I have to live in the woods with my own energy source and my gun and so on. And anything I rely on someone else for is something that enslaves me. That language is obviously it's a small minority, but they make a lot of noise on social media. And even if not everyone goes the full distance in terms of survivalist libertarianism, aspects of that are much more visible in public discourse than they were 30 years ago, when
I think
no one
that's
talked that kind of language except in very small circles. And this is the sign that taking the geographical level down just reproduces the same problem at a different level. And there's a kind of reductio ad absurdum of survivalist libertarianism, which is that attempt to find the right geographical level for political legitimacy. Which
and
is why yeah, sorry, go
it
ahead.
sounds like what people need and are suffering from is they need the sense of belonging or connection, and when you lose some of that legitimacy, you look at the Democrats and Republicans and that chaos happening here in the U.S. I'm like my Canadian passport. I'm like Gollum with the precious, just to like hold on to that thing because the U.S. is is uh, is nuts right now. That kind of a conversation, I think, is what's driving people are losing their sense of connection to the broader picture. And then I guess the comment you're making is then you're in kind of a free fall as to where do you settle in, and then the bottom of that is extreme survival libertarianism, as you call it. Do you see that prevalent in all over the world? Because I thought it was unique to mostly the U.S.
It's peculiar to the US, but not unique to it, I think.
Okay.
And I mean, the big difference is that in the US, there are both ideological resources and practical social resources that survivalists can easily mobilize.
Right. Guns, for example.
Guns and Ayn Rand, shall we say, ideas, technologies. Uh, None of that is so easily available in Europe, where these ideas are routinely mocked
Yeah.
as ridiculous,
Well,
as
I mean,
Marx called it the Crusoe fantasy. And the Crusoe fantasy, not just by Marxists, is usually regarded as ridiculous by Europeans. But it's interesting that the porosity of social media means that things developed in one place circulate much faster now
yeah.
and find resonance. And in Europe, it's interesting to see how, in a different ideological framework, the idea of survivalism has been adopted in the radical environmentalist movement as a logical response to the collapse, not just of state institutions, but also of ecosystems.
Can you
So
can
the
you speak more
same,
about that? Give us an example of that.
an example is the people there are communities in rural France that have organized themselves explicitly on this basis. As it happens, we've been doing some work with one, advising them on institutional structuring and energy transition. This is in the department of Allier in central France. Best known town in Allier is Vichy, known for its thermal water and rather unpleasant political history. So this is about 60, 70 kilometers from Vichy, in the middle of nowhere. And a group of people, ideologically driven, have acquired about 55 hectares. So 55 hectares is what? It's about 150 acres of land, which they jointly own. About 500 people involved, not all literally living there, but all connected in one way or another. And they've invested a lot in organic agriculture and various kinds of cultural activities. They've created a local currency. One of the reasons they want to discuss energy transition is that they'd like, obviously, to go completely off grid and so on. And the way they think about these things is we are in an era of collapse. And some people realize it, some people don't realize it yet. The people who don't realize it yet are vulnerable because when it collapses, they won't be able to cope. We're sort of taking some proactive steps and trying to create the conditions where, by anticipating collapse, we can ensure that at least it doesn't affect us. Now, the difference is that this isn't libertarian in the US sense. It's closer to anarchism in the European sense because it's a commune, it's a collective. But still, basic principle is similar.
I would have thought of this example as agrarianism.
It is agrarian in terms of how it intends to survive, though interestingly, the community was structured originally around a school, a Steiner school. You know, the anthroposophic theories of Rudolf Steiner, which have inspired an educational movement.
Huge.
So while agrarianism is the mode of existence,
right,
their self-identity is actually defined by their relation to an educational institution. Not all of them are directly committed to those ideals and values, but many of them are, and it defines the sort of ethos of the place. Just anecdotally, they have stones that they put at places that mark earth lines of magnetic force in the earth, and so on. So they are very committed to these ideas. They use biodynamic techniques in agriculture too, which are basically the agricultural equivalent of homeopathy.
Yeah.
So there's an ideological context there. But what it is very clearly, sorry, let me backtrack slightly. In the 1970s, this was more about creating a safe space for ideas that were non-mainstream. But as time has evolved, and as a new generation of people who've moved in, increasingly it's become a survivalist project because the environmental dimension has tended to take precedence over the ideological dimension. And the language of collapse is language that these people use, and there are many other examples with different ideological frameworks. So Europe is by no means immune to this. And environmental collapse, in the US, it's a different kind of collapse. It's more social collapse and moral crisis that drives these movements. But in Europe, environmental collapse has driven it very strongly too. And then, of course, you have the hardcore libertarians, even in Europe, like the guy who bought an abandoned gas platform in the North Sea and declared independence.
Right.
He's not recognized by anyone, but at least he claims to have his own state, him and his family.
It's in
on this
international
platform.
waters, right?
It isn't.
It
He
isn't.
wishes it was.
I see.
It's in British waters, so he's clearly subject to British sovereignty.
Oh dear. Okay.
He's claiming independence,
right?
And it's both anecdotal and fun.
You know,
it's a bit like the way free radio in Europe was originally based on a gas platform too. Radio Caroline.
That's right.
Emitted from a gas platform.
That's right.
Pirate radio, as they called it, way back in the day. Anyway.
So when I've talked to other people looking at the same problem, Paul Sappho for one, Vinay Gupta, and I have had a few conversations about this. A fellow called William Ophuls, who was heavily influenced by Joseph Tainter, A Collapse of Civilizations, etc. The general prevalence seems to be that we are seeing a major breakdown of social structures, political structures. Nation states are basically fragmenting, and we're going to end up in an agrarian society. That's one path. Vinay thinks that won't work as long as you have the internet, because agrarian structures won't work if you've got global communications capability. What do you think? So that this is one modality that we could go down. Have you seen others that you find interesting and exciting?
Well, my first comment on that, I'm not sure the institutions are collapsing.
Okay.
They're no longer making sense, but there's a lot of inertia in institutions. They
Yes.
can continue functioning for a long time after the sense they made has become obsolete.
Well, religions would be
Like
the classic example of that.
exactly the way chickens can run for a long time with their heads chopped off, and a lot of our institutions are in that mode. At some point, it will kill them, but they can keep going for a long time.
Yeah.
Um, so the crisis, I think, is less a crisis of the institutions themselves than it is a crisis of the ideas that make sense of the institutions. Now, coming back to topology, I then sidetracked us on something else, but that was where I wanted to go. Um, the In fact, let me track back slightly to something I said earlier. There's a kind of triangle of ideas, institutions, technologies, and that triangle is the triangle that structures the sense making of this institutional political world.
Wait, let me just
Um, yeah,
repeat that. So ideas, institutions, technologies.
yeah.
Okay.
Ideas, obviously, including values, and institutions, including practices and behaviors, and so on, not
Okay.
just formal legal institutions. And if you look at Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation,
Hmm.
classic book on the Industrial Revolution and the creation of political modernity, what's interesting, and I'm basically borrowing this from him, is how he analyzes that moment of transformation between about 1750 and 1830 in terms of a synchronization of transformations at the level of ideas, institutions, and technologies. The invention of democracy as a modern political system, the invention of the steam engine, and a range of other scientific and technological innovations at the same time, and the invention, basically, of the idea of equality.
Hmm.
Now, equality between whom, and so on. The whole question of slavery and colonialism comes into that, but the idea that, in principle at least, we can create a democracy of equals based on technology that allows us to extract value from the earth. All of that fitted together in a way that created the framework within which the nation state became the natural political form
So what you're saying
of
is
modernity.
the modern world and the Industrial Revolution specifically got triggered by an uptick in all three areas: ideas, technology, and institutions.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
then, if you extrapolate from that to move forward into the next leap that we need to take, because we're clearly in a need for a new model, we need to do the same thing. We need to have ideas,
Exactly.
institutions, technologies, all operating in concert and to pop us up. If two out of three or one out of three, you have a cohesion issue, and it doesn't
Exactly.
make it.
So
Okay.
the question then becomes, given the technologies we have, the ideas we have, the institutions we have, given the gaps that induces,
Hmm.
given the tensions and fractures that stem from that, how could these things realign? And what strikes me is that the key technologies of today are technologies of deterritorialization, including, of course, everything to do with the internet. So the attempt to find the right territorial level for governance, authority, legitimacy, living together, and so on, is probably incompatible with the technological framework that, on a
Wow.
scale of not centuries, but decades, we will probably be working within.
So
And many of the newer technologies are trying to take that further,
so
including, for instance, the idea of the metaverse, which would allow not just information, but human experience to be deterritorialized.
Okay. Well, hold on a second. This is a very important concept, and I want to make sure we treat it fully. So what you're saying is new technologies tend to have, as an output or byproduct, deterritorialization.
Yeah,
So, for example, the internet allows everybody to operate interact in a similar way. Metaverse, as you say, would takes that to the full extreme, right?
yeah.
Um, And given that all of our political systems and social structures are territorial, this is obviously a massive problem. So as you deterritorialize, um, then I guess the question is what takes its place?
It's a very good question. I don't have a definite
Can I
answer, but some ideas.
can
Yeah,
I give you
go ahead.
an analogy that we came up with and get your feedback on that analogy? So
Yeah.
about we were looking at this problem about 10 years ago, some colleagues and I, and a fellow called Malcolm Pollock, who's an old coworker and philosophy buff. We basically came up with the idea of a thermodynamic state change, right? So if you have water in an ice form, it's cold, the molecules don't move very far or very fast, it holds its shape, etc. You add energy to the system and it turns into water. Now it flows to the boundaries of the system. It's hotter, it's more active, molecules are more bouncing more against each other, etc., etc. Then you add more energy and it becomes steam. And now it's hot, it burns you, it's trying to break out of any confines you put it. Lots of chaotic interactions between the molecules, etc., etc. Very hard to contain. The observation we had was that technology is moving domain after domain of human experience through an ice to water to steam state. For example, messaging. We used to send homing pigeons and smoke signals and the Pony Express, very local, didn't move very far or very fast. Then you get to the postal mail, which was the liquid state. It could send a letter anywhere in the world. And now we have emails and tweets, which is the vapor state, right? Or you take money. We used to trade camels and goats. Then we moved to letters of credit, right? And then we floated our currencies, and now you have Bitcoin. And social structures, we had tribes, which didn't move very far or very fast, and then nation states, and then multinational corporations, and now Facebook groups, right? And the conclusion we made was in domain after domain after domain, we're moving to this vapor state. And in that, the challenge is in a vapor state, stable structures don't form. Right. And so we saw movements like the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Arab Spring, lots of hot air, but nothing came out of it. And now no solidity, no new solidity emerged, and we fall back to the old. And the question is, how do you navigate that tension? So we looked at it from a physics perspective, like the ideal gas law of social interaction. And I'm curious as whether you agree with that, whether that fits with you, and if so, what do we do about it?
First of all, it's a very telling metaphor. I think its limit is that it's still set on one scale with two variables: temperature, pressure, basically, and reciprocally defined once you define volume. What I see as the challenge, the topological challenge, is that you can't necessarily fit the various levels together in a hierarchy. They coexist and interpenetrate, including the kinds of weird topological spaces that theoretical physicists and mathematicians love, where something connects to itself in messy ways.
Yeah.
And taking your thermodynamic metaphor, we still have a lot of ice, including desirable ice, including the ice of structure, the ice of proximity, the ice of stability. We can all be global migrants, but not everyone wants to move. We can all be tweeting 17 hours a day, but some people do like to watch the grass grow, and so on. So those structures, those stable, rather frozen structures, since we're talking about literally ice, still have their place. And they have their place perhaps particularly at local level, but not exclusively. The liquid structures are still, and it's interesting you mentioned that. I don't know if you know Zygmunt Bauman's book from the early 1990s about the liquid world, I think it was called.
Whoa, no, I don't. I must look into that.
And it's similar to your point about how things that were solid become liquid. And of course, more generally, that metaphor, all that is solid melts into air, is in the Communist Manifesto. It's one of the most striking phrases that Marx and Engels wrote way back in 1848. In capitalism, all that is solid melts into air.
Yeah.
But I think what we would need, given the technologies we have, given the kinds of institutional resources we have, and given the ideas to make sense of them, is something like the thermodynamic triple point, which in any phase diagram exists, but is not always attainable in practice, because sometimes the empirical conditions are impossible. Water has a triple point, but where it is at the same time ice, liquid water, and vapor.
Yeah.
But you need some very weird conditions of temperature and pressure to reach it. And it's a very unstable triple point.
That's actually a wonderful way of framing it. We hadn't thought of that. We thought the next level would be a plasma state.
It could be.
It could be. But the triple point is probably a more accurate representation, where you could create the environment where this thing forms, and you have a localized phenomena, right? And we could see that now and then.
What that would mean is thinking not so much about levels, but about connections between levels. It's clear that people, basically anyone, both empirically and also normatively, desirably, needs to have a local space to operate in. But that local space isn't simply territorial. It's also the space of technologically mediated long distance relationships.
Yeah.
My home base, my small space, includes people living on the other side of the world with whom I have a relationship which might pre-exist the digital connection or be created by it. I can talk to my cousin in Portland, Oregon. I do actually have one. Hi, Mick. But of course, that relationship, which is a family relationship, pre-existed his emigrating to the US. But there are other people that I've never met except online, of whom indeed, Salim, you're one. I hope we will get to meet in the real world at some point, but all our interactions so far have been digitally mediated.
As rich as they've been,
space,
they have been very been digital, yes.
I'm part of your space, you're part of my space. So the meaning of what used to be local in a Euclidean sense has been expanded by digital technologies to a new kind of locality, which is spread, dispersed across time and space in new ways. But that's still important to us.
Yeah.
At the same time, we obviously need to exist in spaces of economic interaction, cultural interaction, leisure interaction, and so on, which have physical constraints on them. Despite my age and the state of my knees, I still play soccer. I play soccer with people my age, or it would be impossible. But we can only play soccer if we actually meet up on the same pitch on a Sunday morning.
Right.
So some things are physically constrained. Other things aren't. I can share ideas with people all over the world. I can talk business with people all over the world. On the other hand, if I want to actually sell them stuff, like solar modules, which is one of the things one of my companies makes, then those solar modules have to be put together in an industrial facility, and they have to be transported to a consumer. So we're both embedded in the physical world, which creates certain kinds of Euclidean constraints, and at the same time we can transcend that physical world through technologies that are non-Euclidean. And the best way in which you can see that they're non-Euclidean is that the communication system is a transmitter-receiver system, which means that the information transmitted doesn't actually exist as information in between the transmitter and the receiver.
Right.
Particularly if it's encrypted, for instance. It's the electromagnetic radiation follows a path in physical space, but the information doesn't. The information actually, in a sense, ceases to exist and is reconstituted by the receiver. And if the receiver is destroyed, then the emitter is emitting into a void.
Yeah.
So there's something fundamentally non-Euclidean, which isn't Riemannian or anything else either. It's not spherical geometry. It's some higher level of geometry. And finally, the world, the whole planet, is increasingly part of our experience as humans, because of consciousness of planetary interdependency, because of consciousness of planetary vulnerability, and at a more symbolic level, because the idea of humanity probably means something different to many people these days. It always meant something as an abstract horizon. Humanity is our common feature. It's what we're part of. So we can think in terms of humanity as a whole. We can define human rights, for instance. And we can think about the common interest of humanity. But humanity as subject is quite a new idea that's very connected to planetary interconnections. And of course, humanity as a subject doesn't have a political expression these days. The United Nations isn't the expression of humanity as a subject. It's the expression of the separate member states coming together on an intergovernmental basis.
Where do you see
quite
examples?
A few people have written books about this.
This is a great topic. Where do you see examples of humanity as a subject? The first thing that pops to my head is art. Is one expression. Do you see others?
Yeah, I think the environmental movement is all about trying to create humanity as a subject.
Okay.
In dialogue with non-humans.
Right.
Of course, the idea of dialogue with non-humans is itself very interesting. It sounds like a loose metaphor, but it's also a tangible reality. What does the IPCC do except structure a dialogue with the oceans, the cryosphere, the atmosphere, through the medium of scientific monitoring?
This
reminds me. We don't speak exactly the same language, but we're speaking to one another.
Yeah,
and of course, the planet's getting angry.
This reminds me of a project. One of the favorite projects I came across a few years ago was a machine learning effort to translate dolphin language. And they figured they were going to get to it by about 2022. I'm dying to know what happened there, because it'd be an incredible breakthrough to be able to communicate back and forth with the dolphin. We probably don't want to hear what they have to say, which is another commentary referencing what you said earlier. Humanity as subject is a fascinating question, because now you kind of think of where do you fit in the broader picture, right? And this brings us back to some very big existential questions. Who out there in the world today have you come across that's doing the most interesting thinking and work around this?
Well, let me mention one person who I think everyone has heard of, the recently deceased French philosopher Bruno Latour. Did some really very interesting work around this idea, particularly around the idea of hybrid publics. In other words, publics that include not just humans talking to one another, but also the non-humans they interact with. And Latour's work has been extremely influential, and I think opens a very important door to a way of thinking that will be a central part of the ideas of the future. And your dolphin example is really very telling. I think I read actually a few months ago, late 2022, so perhaps precisely the outcome of the research you're referring to, that tests on communicating to dolphins by emitting dolphin messages coded by humans has now been done, and we're basically waiting to see how the dolphins receive this.
Wow!
And if you've read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you know that dolphins are the second most intelligent species on the planet.
Yes.
Humans being the third.
Yes. The first
one
was
mice.
Mice. That's right. It's the mice.
But of course, the joke in Douglas Adams is that the mice are simply the three-dimensional manifestation of pan-dimensional beings.
Right.
Which brings us back to topology. So Latour is a good example of the attempt to break down some of those barriers. In other words, not simply to think about globalizing the national or localizing the national, but think about all the different levels together and think about the connections between those levels in light, among other things, of environmental codependency. Latour doesn't talk a lot about technology, but I think it's equally important to think about technological codependency. I'm very interested in the whole question of the ethical status of machines, for instance, on which there's a lot of very interesting recent work around artificial intelligence, around robots, and so on. The non-human world we'll need to live in, which we are creating, for better, for worse, is a world composed of tigers and dolphins and mangroves and bacteria and so on. But it's also a world composed of networks and machines that we have designed to have properties that might perhaps escape our control. And one way or another, we're going to have to live with all of that.
Yeah.
So it's a world that is more considerably more complex than just how to organize stuff among humans. That's the first dimension of complexity, and considerably more complex than that rather neat sequential ordering of space that we used to have, from village to province to city to continent to planet.
Hey folks, Salim here. I am so excited about our latest launch, the Exponential Organizations 2.0 book. It's a living book. This baby is a living, breathing, always up-to-date source of knowledge on the latest technologies and techniques for transforming organizations and building 10x growth and impact. How do we build a better future using the latest and greatest 21st century techniques? And the best part, you don't have to do anything. You just sign up for our basic tier, which is only $4 a month, and boom, you have instant access plus an AI chatbot interface into the book. You can cancel anytime, but there's more. We have a community of technologists, entrepreneurs, innovators, disruptors, thought leaders that we can exchange ideas with. You can tap into that ecosystem to build your dream. What is your massive transformative purpose? And the book plus the ecosystem in our community is set up for you to help leverage that and build it. So come along. It's a mind-boggling capability that we've built. Trust me on this and come and see us. That was my wine delivery, now successfully transacted. And you needed a signature, so there we go.
For anyone sitting in France, wine is one of the three most important things in the world, right?
And what are the other two?
I didn't actually think in advance of that. I suppose the classic caricature of a French intellectual would say women and philosophy.
Okay. It's apropos at this point. Let me throw out the definition, the best definition I ever heard about the French, which was from the CEO of Groupama, the mutual insurance company. And I was doing a project to transform the company. I was going crazy, and I finally took him aside and I said, God, French people are incredibly difficult to work with. Why are French people so hard to work with? And he said, oh, let me show you this. And he pulled out this article. I think it was somebody from the UN that was asked this question. It might have been the UN ambassador from France or something. And he had this big quote circled, and he said, the problem with us in France is that we will say it works in practice, but will it work in theory?
Yeah.
And that just nailed it. And once you hear that, you're like, oh, everything makes sense now about the French.
Absolutely. So often quoted and rightly so. So, and your city question, coming back to it, is really, I think, at the heart of everything we're talking about. I think there are two ways of thinking about the city level. One is taking the nation state down to the city level to make it more manageable. And I've expressed my skepticism that could work. More interesting is the idea that by networking cities, you can produce a new kind of topology of global space, not exclusive of other kinds of levels and interactions, but introducing a specific level of interaction that breaks the boundaries and creates new kinds of circulation around shared issues and around a certain level of governmental organization. And indeed, this is happening to some extent, but of course, states are very reluctant to give cities autonomy to do it. But a movement like the C40 movement, which is an association of 40 big cities worldwide, currently, in fact, chaired by the mayor of Paris, as it happens, is an attempt to create that kind of networking logic. Not saying that cities are the right level to govern things, but saying that the interaction between cities of different kinds in different places creates the right kinds of wormholes, effectively, to enrich the topology.
I think that's a very important point, right? When I like part of the discussion of this thinking comes from, if you look at Trump or Brexit, it wasn't left versus right, it's urban versus rural, right? Brexit was 100% London versus the rest of the country. And we see that same tension playing out everywhere in the world. Sao Paulo versus the rest of Brazil, the complaints about Paris from the rest of France or Legion. There's a different modality in cities than the rest of rural environments, and this is the fundamental tension. What you're saying is, if you connect a bunch of cities together, you create a new type of a topology, and that allows for human behaviors to operate in new modalities that are more reflective of today's world and the technologies we have today.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
What are some other examples of topologies or cities or that type of a thing that you see that are relevant today, that might work?
Well, networking hyperlocal forms of organization is another good example. Many of these communes that I referred to, or these survivalist enclaves, are not really isolated, because the one thing they take from mainstream society, as you said earlier, is technologies of connection. So that networking the hyperlocal also creates topological richness.
I think you and I've talked about this before. I'm on the advisory board of an organization called Exponential Institute for Coordination that's trying to create a set of networked hyperlocal environments. Most kind of kibbutz and type of structures are try to be isolationist, right? And for political or ideological reasons, as we mentioned earlier. But if you actually connect them, you can do some really fascinating things at that hyperlocal level, but now networked across the world, which become very interesting.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about that is that the connections aren't mainly about trade in the traditional sense. They're about ideas.
Yeah.
Including learning from experience, which means creating spaces of collective intelligence, which are no longer geographically defined. It's something like taking the old idea, the 20th century idea of clusters, which was this idea of how regional economics should be imagined, if a cluster being a certain level of density of interaction that allows innovation to emerge. And there are good examples from the 20th century of that actually happening. But of course, everyone in the 21st century was trying to create clusters when clusters were already yesterday's idea.
Yeah. What's
probably more interesting, and the pandemic shakeup has made everyone aware of this, with telework and lockdowns and so on. It was an eye opener for many people, is that you don't actually need that physical proximity of residents to have those kinds of interactions where collective intelligence emerges from the sharing of experience. Of course, you might need to meet up sometimes, but that doesn't necessarily mean living together.
Yeah.
In the same geographical space.
We're living that with our community, right? The OpenEXO community is now 22,000 members, or in 137 countries, and it's incredible the richness of interaction we have in that community. They have local meetups, and then we have regional time zone friendly meetups, and then we have global conflagrations like that. EXO World event that you participated in 2-3 years ago, and I think this leads to the concept that Balaji Srinivasan has been promoting, called the network state. If you're familiar with that, I had an issue with that, and I wanted to get your take on it. It was basically, the idea was an online community coalescing into essentially the equivalent of a nation state, and then he said all you have to now do is get legitimacy from some existing nation state, and that's where I found the breakdown. I thought, wait a minute, that's a big hop. It's a little black box in there going, nobody's ever going to say yes to this, and you're back to square one. I'm curious as to your reaction around that.
I think for the same reasons we were discussing earlier, looking for the one right level of anything is not going to work. In other words, we should be looking at these processes and levels of organization, dynamics of self-organization, not as alternatives, but as complements. Now, of course, if you step back a bit and sort of look 50 years down the line, as you pile up overlapping modes of organization, some territorial, some non-territorial, at some point, and this brings us back to phase transitions, this is going to create tipping points within the system. But I think it would be self-defeating to try to anticipate exactly what those tipping points might be. So in other words, the task that we face is less the task of designing a new world than the task of creating the enabling conditions from which a new world can emerge. If you try to plan it too tightly, you're just going to confine it within the limits of existing ideas.
100% agree with that. You create the ecosystem and the enabling conditions, and then hope for the emergent. In fact, historically, successful movements have almost always appeared in this modality, right? There was some fascinating work done by I've forgotten the lady's name, a Dutch philosopher, a quantum physicist who posited this, and she said it's almost like the creation of these types of new ideas it's like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, and that interface between the two is almost like a woman giving birth. You have these pulses of contractual labor pulses that get stronger and stronger and stronger, and in the end the new idea has no option but to pop out, right? And it's a beautiful metaphor, and she's put quite a lot of detail, done a whole PhD thesis on it. And I think it feels to me that we're in that type of contraction. We're kind of honing these new modalities and testing them out in a safe space before they kind of emerge. You don't know what's going to come out.
Absolutely, and I'm not sure the space can necessarily be safe. There's dangers too. Every time you give birth, a monster could emerge.
could emerge. Very, very true. I mean, look, over the last couple of days, we've seen the emergence of ChatGPT 4, right? And I'm looking at that stunned, that pretty much it renders every white collar job is threatened in the world. Every white collar job in the world is threatened. And we thought that automation would affect blue collar workers. And so everybody's worried about that. And it turns out, no, the pandemic showed you need your local delivery folks and the people driving the trucks and cleaning the streets and all that stuff infinitely more than somebody thinking about project management.
Absolutely.
And I think
with one of my business partners in one of my businesses, we started thinking about this as a medium-term project. Needs partners, it needs finance and so on. But the question is a very simple one. Within the collapse framework that we were discussing earlier, so not a framework predicting collapse, but a framework putting the possibility of collapse at the heart of contemporary thinking. There's no guarantee that our systems, including our food systems and transport systems and so on, will survive. So how can we create something that's resilient, robust to the possibility of collapse? And that requires thinking, among other things, about, imagine you have to survive as a small community. What skills do you need to survive as a small group of people, a couple of hundred people? And maybe we should rethink the education system around those skills. And what's interesting is that there are many traditional manual skills, carpenters, blacksmiths, and so on, but also through symbolic skills. And more importantly, we need to overcome the division between the two. We need to create synergies between the various kinds of skills that can allow a community to sustain itself. And then if you go a step further, why wait for collapse? This is what we always needed anyway, even within the parameters of current society. So doing it is both building resilience in the face of possible existential threats, and also just making the world as it is a better place. And of course, creating conditions for emergence. So we're thinking about how we might be able to set up some new kind of educational institution around that.
Okay, so let me just go back to that comment that you just made. I want to double down on that. And then I want to talk more about what you're up to and the different domains you're kind of exploring in this. So you said that you need to take the idea of collapse or systemic collapse as a given almost in and take that into account. Can you repeat that for the folks listening?
Yeah, the idea is that often collapse is seen as a predictive scenario. Things will collapse or might collapse. But it's actually much more interesting to bring that into the present as part of our existential framing. The possibility of collapse is a present possibility, not just a future threat. And if you deal with it as a present possibility, then you'll respond to it in very different ways than if you simply try to prevent it in the future. And in particular, that raises the question, well, what should a community look like? And what's interesting is that thinking about what a community would need to look like to deal with collapse actually leads you to some interesting thoughts about what a community would need to look like as things are. That's the interesting angle.
Yeah.
Bringing into the present those future possibilities as possibilities. And we're not very good at that as humans. We're much more comfortable with certainties,
we're terrible
with things happening.
Yeah.
But if you can't incorporate possibilities, then you're not going to be able to deal with them, including the ones that you completely fail to imagine.
Black swan events. I call them Gutenberg moments. I make the comment that we have 20 Gutenberg moments hitting us at the same time. And by the way, I tweeted a couple of days ago that with the announcement of ChatGPT 4, we've now hit a kind of existential singularity where our brains cannot process the speed at which changes are taking place. I thought I was pretty good at it until 2 days ago. Now I'm feeling I can't cope anymore. Let me. You're the CEO of PhGD Group.
Yeah.
And tell us what business endeavors you're up to, because 18 years at UNESCO, plus running the foresight and social efforts there, have given you a perspective that few people in the world have. So what does that give you guidance, and how is that informing, and what are you up to? What are the top 3 or 4 projects you're up to and excited about these days?
So first of all, my slogan, which actually summarizes the whole approach, producing better, consuming less. That's what I want to work towards through technologies and ideas.
We call that an MTP, by the way, a massive transformative purpose. So
yeah, exactly.
Produce better, consume less.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are many ways of thinking about consuming less, including sort of neo-feudal, renouncing worldly stuff and so on. That's not what I want to work on primarily, because I'm much more interested in the idea of efficient intelligent systems, which allow you to do more with less, than I am in simply reducing the heat, so to speak. I'm convinced that there is a huge space for much more intelligent organizations of energy systems in particular that doesn't necessarily require people to consume less energy, but does require the systems to transform themselves. So that's the basic principle. This divides into 2 sets of business lines, one ideas focused and the other technology focused. The ideas focused business lines, and it's partly accidental that I met different people at different times, and we decided to hook up as business partners without bringing everyone together into one company. That's just the way it evolved, very, very organically. I have 2 consulting companies, one focusing on transformative practices, which is called Hagrad, with a business partner called Patrick de Georges. And we're the people thinking about the question of collapse, for instance. What we're trying to do is turn the idea of transformative practices into very concrete, practical ways of helping institutions, particularly public institutions at the moment, but private institutions should be interested too, and where relevant, even individuals, to use practices that lever transformation. And those practices can be spiritual, artistic, psychotherapeutic. And we have some really good partners we can work with that can set up events, training programs, activities that allow groups of people, senior managers, for instance, from the corporate sector, or people running public institutions, to come together and be shaken up for the good, for their own good and for the good of the businesses they run. And this actually works quite nicely. It's a new company. We didn't even have any cash flow until the beginning of 2022, so we're still building, but looking promising. The other consulting company, which I remember we discussed a couple of years ago, is focusing on the question of trust and trying to operationalize trust through a series of techniques summarized by a concept called the tree of trust, which is a 7-dimensional model of trust. And we're currently developing that with a particular focus at the moment on Africa, interestingly. My business partner, Pierre Viniki, who invented much of the content, is in Cameroon at the moment and spending probably 2/3 of his time in Cameroon, building a really ambitious project called Cameroon Trust 2030, 2030 as in the UN Development Goals, working with government, civil society, businesses, and the UN system in Cameroon to see how you can transform the idea of development for a whole country through the lens of trust. And
wow.
I think there's a lot of potential there.
There's a ton of fascinating ideas there. Jerry Mikulski talks about this as scarcity equals abundance minus trust, right? And if you want to bridge to a world of abundance, we have to solve the trust problem. Yes. And so it's awesome that you're working on initiatives like that. Where can people track your work or find you?
Well, my website isn't great because I run it myself for the moment. I'm short of resources, but at least it gives an entry point. So that's www.phdd.group.
Okay.
And that gives an entry point to the separate websites of the various businesses that I have a stake in. And then alongside the ideas component, which is important to me because I've always been an ideas person. As you could see, I can talk forever about this stuff. There are also industrial ventures that are actually about specific technologies, all of which are defined, they're all energy technologies, defined in terms of a use concept. And the use concept is energy autonomy, giving consumers the opportunity to control their production better. And we have that at 3 different scales. There's a solar business, which is an existing business with cash flow that already sells its product, the product being plug-and-play solar modules. So solar modules that are put together in such a way that they're delivered ready to function, plug them in, they deliver power. So hyper simple solar power for people who want access to solar power but don't want to mess with their roof or can't afford to, and don't want to mess with their electrical setup. That is really getting a lot of traction because it's a competitive market. My business partner, Jean-François Fausse, invented the technology a few years ago. It's been copied in the meantime, but the market is growing very, very fast. Because even in a country like France, which traditionally has been very confident in its nuclear power, people are worried about 2 things: electricity prices and possible blackouts.
Yeah.
And the combination of those 2 fears mean that you're looking for ways of protecting yourself at home. And home production, particularly if it's simple and comparatively cheap, without all the costs of putting rooftop solar in, is very attractive. And it's, of course, the simplest kilowatt scale option. Other options exist, like low temperature geothermal, or even like home-based wind, but they're considerably more expensive because they're at higher scales of capacity. So kilowatt scale solar.
Okay. I remember having a chat with one of the C-suite of EDF, and I was talking about cultural transformation and how you have to take on the Bill Gates kind of assumption of healthy paranoia, that something will disrupt you. You have to, and he was like, We run 80% of the energy in France. We're the leading nuclear thing in the world. Nothing's going to disrupt us. I can't get anybody to listen. And literally 3 weeks later, Fukushima happened.
Yeah.
And then their world kind of collapsed. I mean, this is a world where the comment you made earlier, I think, is absolutely telling. You have to think about collapse in the present tense and assume that we're in it almost. And now, how do you think about the future going forward? Right? Any other technologies that you're looking at deeply?
Two that I'll mention, but your point about nuclear is really so important. And I mean, EDF is an incredibly powerful and even successful company. But what it's dealing with at the moment is cracks. In other words, metal quality issues, metallurgical issues of aging on pipes, trivial issues, not even specifically nuclear issues, because they're not on the nuclear part of the facility at all. But if those cracks aren't solved, then eventually the plant breaks down. So there's fragility built into the level of metal molecules, poorly handled, poorly welded, or poorly designed, or whatever. And no one saw it coming. And now it's become a systemic problem because many of these facilities were built to the same plan. They'll find a solution, of course, but a lot of capacity is offline, which means the fear of blackouts and prices rising even more than they would have anyway with the natural gas issue in Europe, and uncertainties about the future. So home-based solar looks cool to many individuals. That's a B2C product. At the 100 kilowatt scale, we're developing a very exciting concept for wind energy. Historically, wind energy at 100 kilowatt scale was pretty routine. There was a lot of it about, but it was very old technology, not very efficient. And then the big operators basically abandoned that scale of facility because they were going to much bigger things. So there's a gap in the market. And we're convinced, again, as a use case, that there's a lot of space for that scale of wind production for farms and small businesses, village collectives possibly. 100 kilowatts is basically the equivalent of 10 households who could come together to consume the production from such a facility. And because they're much smaller than the traditional European wind turbine, same in the US, they can be sited much more flexibly. A 100 kilowatt turbine is 25 meters high, as against 180 meters for the 2 or 3 megawatt models that are all over the countryside. So this is a much earlier stage project. We have a patent, and we need to fund the prototype. So if anyone's interested, get in touch with me. Actively looking for funding for that. As for the whole business, but that one is very specific. We need to fund the prototype. And we see enormous potential for this to basically fill the gaps where wind is relevant, not relevant anywhere, unlike solar, which works more or less anywhere. But where the resource is good, then there are gaps to be filled that will introduce resilience and flexibility by locating electricity production closer to the consumer.
Incredible.
And then the third project is exciting too. It's a much more frontier project technology, but it has already been prototyped. We're trying to get it to market now. It's a technology that uses magnetic energy, permanent magnets and background magnetic fields to produce continuous zero emission energy, which, unlike other renewable sources, is also compact. Doesn't take a lot of space, whereas wind and solar do by their very nature. You can fit a megawatt on about 4,000 square meters, an acre. And a megawatt on an acre is much better than wind or solar can possibly do. This is slightly controversial technology because many people are convinced it can't work because it's very much connected to ideas that ultimately come from Nikola Tesla. He imagined this. It's just that my business partners have built it.
It's a dangerous game to argue against that man.
Exactly.
As we see, the history has shown that many of his ideas that weren't, the world would have been much better off if we'd have listened to him more.
Absolutely.
AC
And the
versus
whole
DC current,
story,
for example. All
absolutely.
that.
The whole story is fascinating. The way in which he sold all his patents to Westinghouse, who just shredded them basically.
Yeah, yeah,
Bought them deliberately so as not to use them
yeah.
because they would have been too disruptive.
To their own business model. Yep. Oh,
And he made a lot of money
fascinating.
from it, which he then wasted by building his wild dream in Long Island, his dream of the Wardenclyffe emissions tower. Which, anyway, fascinating man, totally mad, but
Total
incredibly
genius.
clever.
So,
Total genius.
John, we're running out of time.
Yeah,
I would love to have a follow up with you because
pleasure.
I feel like we've kind of just tickled at the surface of some of these. There's some ideas that popped up that I would love to explore more, like the collapse of the present and some of the topology discussions, that triangle of ideas and technologies and institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So perhaps we can do a follow up sometime.
I'd be delighted.
Let me wrap this up. This has been the Salim Ismail podcast, episode number 10. Phenomenal conversation with John Crowley. More to come on this. John, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Salim. Great pleasure.
I am so excited to announce the launch of our new OpenEXO platform. It's a game changer for those of us who are passionate about building a better future through the breakthroughs of new technology, plus new mechanisms for exponential organizations. First things first, the platform is home to the amazing Exponential Organizations 2.0 book, a living book, which means it's constantly updated with the latest case studies and the greatest breakthroughs in technology. ChatGPT, for example, is incorporated into the book already. With a basic membership of just $4 a month, you have access to all of the resources, 700 plus case studies. If you're not satisfied, you can cancel anytime. And it actually features a job board to help you connect with like-minded individuals, plus an AI curated news feed that's head and shoulders above everybody else. So why not join today? Be part of a community that's working together to build a future. And for those of us who are ready to go full throttle, our premium membership offers even more perks. You'll have access to the courses and masterminds, communities of experts and thought leaders who are changing the game and building exponential organizations to transform the world. So what are you waiting for? Join us today and let's build a future together.